Chapter 1. The Return. The Afghan sun had beaten down on Captain Danny Dale for 18 months, but nothing had prepared him for the cold reception waiting at home. The military transport touched down at Fort Carson on a crisp October morning, and Danny felt the familiar weight of anticipation mixed with anxiety. Home. Family. His 8-year-old son, Austin, who'd grown from a toddler to a boy through video calls and care packages. Danny Dale wasn't your average soldier. At 32, he'd earned his captain's bars through intelligence work, spending his deployment coordinating counterintelligence operations rather than kicking down doors. His mind was his weapon, sharp, analytical, always 3 steps ahead. Standing 6'2", with graying temples that made him look distinguished rather than old. Danny had the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. The original plan was simple: surprise his family. He'd coordinated with his neighbor, Jim Peterson, to keep the homecoming secret. Sandy Dale, his wife of 10 years, thought he wouldn't be back for another month. Danny wanted to see Austin's face light up when Dad walked through the door unannounced. But life, as Danny had learned in the military, rarely followed the plan. The house on Maple Street looked different. Not physically, the same blue shutters, the same oak tree he'd helped Austin climb before deployment, but something felt wrong. Danny's trained eye caught details. Fresh tire tracks in the driveway that didn't match Sandy's Honda. Cigarette butts near the front porch though Sandy had quit smoking years ago. And most tellingly, the garage door was open, revealing tools scattered across the workbench in a way that screamed of someone else's presence. Danny parked 2 blocks away and approached on foot, muscle memory from countless surveillance operations kicking in. Through the living room window, he could see Sandy laughing with a man Danny didn't recognize. Tall, stocky, with the kind of swagger that screamed insecurity over compensation. The man's hand were on Sandy's waist in a way that made Danny's jaw clench. But where was Austin? Danny circled to the backyard, his heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The boy was there, sitting alone on the swing set Danny had built the summer before deployment. But something was wrong. Austin's posture was hunched, defeated in a way no 8-year-old should ever be. "Austin," Danny called softly. The boy's head snapped up, and Danny felt his world tilt. Austin's face was a map of fading bruises, but more shocking were his hands. Both were wrapped in thick bandages, the kind used for serious injuries. Austin's eyes, Danny's own brown eyes, filled with a mixture of joy and terror. "Daddy," Austin whispered, looking toward the house nervously. "You're not supposed to be here." Danny knelt beside his son, fighting to keep his voice steady. "What happened to your hands, buddy?" Austin looked away, the practiced shame of an abused child already embedded in his young psyche. "I'm not supposed to tell. You can tell me anything. You know that. Mom's boyfriend, Victor, he said I was being bad. Said these hands would never hold a gun like a coward's." Austin's voice broke. "He used a hammer, Daddy. It hurts so much." The world went silent except for the roaring in Danny's ears. His son, his brave, curious, brilliant son, had been deliberately crippled by some piece of garbage who'd moved into his home. The rational part of Danny's mind, the part trained in strategic thinking, was being rapidly overwhelmed by something much more primal. "Where's he now?" Danny asked, his voice deadly calm. "Inside with Mom. They don't know you're back." "Daddy, I'm scared he'll hurt me again if he knows I told you." Danny pulled his son close, careful of the damaged hands. "Nobody is ever going to hurt you again. I promise you that." As if summoned by Danny's rage, the back door opened. Victor Moore stepped out, and Danny got his first clear look at the man who destroyed his son's hands. Mid-30s, about Danny's height, but carrying an extra 40 pounds of beer gut. His face had the florid complexion of a heavy drinker, and his eyes held the mean intelligence of a bully who'd learned to pick his victims carefully. Well, Victor said, his voice carrying a distinct Arkansas drawl. "Look what the cat dragged in." Danny stood slowly, positioning himself between Victor and Austin. "You must be Victor." "That's right. And you must be the war hero Sandy's been crying about." Victor's smile was ugly. "Funny thing about heroes, they're never around when you need them." "I'm here now." Victor stepped closer, and Danny caught the smell of alcohol and stale cigarettes. "You know what your problem is, soldier boy? You left your family unprotected. Nature abhors a vacuum. I just filled it. Danny's hands clenched into fists, but his voice remained level. We'll see about that. We sure will. Victor glanced at Austin with unconcealed malice. Your boy's been learning some lessons about respect. Ain't you, Austin? Austin pressed closer to Danny, trembling. That's when Sandy appeared in the doorway, her face cycling through shock, guilt, and something that might have been relief. Danny, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You're early. 20 minutes later, Danny found himself in the surreal position of sitting in his own living room, being told by his wife why their marriage was over and why Victor Moore was the best thing that had ever happened to her. Victor sat beside her, arm possessively around her shoulders, occasionally interjecting comments designed to humiliate Danny. But Danny wasn't listening to the words. He was cataloging details, building a profile. Victor Moore was a predator who'd found easy prey in a lonely military wife. The type who used intimidation and violence to maintain control. The type who would cripple a child to send a message. The type who was about to learn that some messages demanded a very specific response. Chapter 2. The Investigation. Danny checked into a motel that night, taking Austin with him despite Sandy's protests. No judge in the world would award custody to a woman whose boyfriend had hospitalized a child, and Sandy knew it. Victor had threatened to finish what he started if Austin told anyone about the accident, but even Sandy wasn't willing to risk that liability. At the emergency room, Dr. Elena Rodriguez confirmed Danny's worst fears. Austin's hands had been deliberately crushed, requiring multiple surgeries and months of physical therapy. There was a possibility, a slim one, that he might regain partial use of his fingers, but he would never have full function again. The injuries are consistent with blunt force trauma, Dr. Rodriguez explained, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They targeted the metacarpals and phalanges specifically. Danny's jaw worked silently. Victor hadn't just lashed out in anger. He'd systematically destroyed Austin's hands with surgical precision. This wasn't abuse. It was torture. Over the next 3 days, Danny did what he did best. He gathered intelligence. His military contacts proved invaluable. And what he learned about Victor Moore painted a picture of a man who'd been escalating his violence for years. Victor had been married twice before. His first wife, Karen Bryan, had died in what was ruled an accidental fall down a flight of stairs. The second, Bethany Hurst, had disappeared entirely 3 years ago, though no charges were ever filed. Both women had children from previous relationships. Those children had all suffered accidents under Victor's care. But Victor was smart. He chose victims carefully, single mothers, military wives, women who were isolated and vulnerable. He never stayed in one place long enough for patterns to emerge, and he had an uncanny ability to avoid leaving evidence that would stand up in court. Danny also learned that Victor wasn't working alone. His brother, Shane Moore, had a rap sheet including assault, battery, and suspected involvement in several disappearances. Where Victor was the charming predator, Shane was the muscle. Together, they formed a predatory partnership that had been operating across 3 states for nearly a decade. The revelation that Austin wasn't Victor's first victim sent Danny into a cold fury that his military training helped him channel into planning. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice for victims who never had anyone capable of fighting back. On the 4th day, Danny received an unexpected visitor. Jim Peterson knocked on his motel door with coffee and information that changed everything. I knew something was wrong, Jim said, settling into the motel's single chair. Sandy started acting strange about 6 months after you deployed. Stopped talking to the neighbors, stopped letting Austin play with the other kids. Jim was a good man, a contractor in his 50s who'd lived next door for 8 years. He'd watched Austin grow up, had even helped with homework during video calls when Danny was overseas. His guilt at not intervening was written across his weathered face. There's something else, Jim continued. Victor's been using your garage as some kind of workshop. I've seen him bringing tools, equipment, and there's been traffic, people coming and going at odd hours. That evening, Danny conducted surveillance on his own home. What he saw confirmed his suspicions. Victor wasn't just an abuser. He was running some kind of operation out of Danny's garage. Cars came and went. Men Danny didn't recognize carried packages. And through the window, he could see Victor directing activities with the confidence of someone in charge. The pieces clicked into place. Victor Moore was using Danny's deployment and his control over Sandy to establish a base of operations for something bigger than domestic abuse. The question was what, and more importantly, how Danny could use that information to destroy him. Danny's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Your boy got off easy. Keep asking questions, and we'll finish the job. S. Shane Moore." The brother was making threats now, which meant they knew Danny was investigating. Good. Let them know he was coming. It would make their eventual downfall all the sweeter. Danny Dale had spent 18 months fighting an enemy that hid in shadows and struck without warning. But Victor and Shane Moore had made a critical error. They'd given him something to fight for that was more important than his own life. They'd hurt his son, and for that, they were going to pay in ways they couldn't imagine. Chapter 3. The plan takes shape. The local police proved to be exactly what Danny expected. Sympathetic but powerless. Detective Sergeant Claire Morrison took Austin's statement and promised to look into it, but her expression told Danny everything he needed to know. Without witnesses, clear evidence, or a victim willing to testify, there was nothing they could do. Victor had crafted his story well. Austin had fallen while playing in the garage. Tragic accident. No criminal intent. "Understand your frustration, Captain Dale," Detective Morrison said, her voice carrying genuine regret. "But legally, our hands are tied. The best I can do is recommend family court for custody proceedings." Danny nodded politely, but inside, he was already moving to Plan B. The system had failed his son, which meant the system was no longer relevant to this situation. That night, Danny sat in his motel room with Austin sleeping beside him, planning the most important operation of his life. On his laptop screen were files, photos, and connections that painted a picture of the Moore brothers' operation. They weren't just abusers. They were traffickers, moving something valuable enough to justify the risk of operating out of a deployed soldier's garage. Danny's military training had taught him that successful operations required 3 elements: intelligence, timing, and overwhelming force applied at the point of maximum vulnerability. He had the intelligence now. The timing would come soon. As for overwhelming force, well, that's where creativity came in. His phone rang. The caller ID showed Austin's school. "Mr. Dale, this is Principal Williams. I'm calling because Austin hasn't been in school for a week, and when I tried to reach your wife, she said he was too injured to attend. Can you clarify what's going on?" Another piece of the puzzle. Victor and Sandy had been keeping Austin isolated, preventing him from telling anyone about what had happened. But it also meant that the school, the neighbors, hell, probably the whole community was aware something was wrong. Danny made a decision that would change everything. "Principal Williams, my son was assaulted. His hands were deliberately broken with a hammer. I'm taking care of him now, but I need your help with something." 20 minutes later, Danny had enlisted Principal Williams, Dr. Rodriguez from the hospital, and Jim Peterson in a plan that would give the Moore brothers exactly what they deserved while ensuring they could never hurt another child. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its scope. Danny would give Victor and Shane exactly what they thought they wanted, a clear field to operate without interference. But he would also give them something else, the attention of people who made the local police look like mall security. Phase 1 involved documentation. Every parent in Austin's class would know what had happened. Every teacher, every school board member, every family in their community would understand that predators had been operating among them. Danny wasn't just seeking revenge. He was building a groundswell of public outrage that would make the Moore brothers toxic in this town forever. Phase 2 would hit their operation. Whatever they were running out of his garage, Danny was going to shut it down in a way that would attract federal attention. Because while local police might overlook child abuse, federal agencies took a very dim view of trafficking operations, especially ones run out of military families' homes. Phase 3 was personal. Victor Moore had promised that Austin's hands would never hold a gun like a coward's. Danny was going to test that theory in the most direct way possible. But first, he needed to understand exactly what the Moore brothers were trafficking. And for that, he needed to get into his own garage without being seen. The opportunity came 2 days later. Sandy called, crying, saying Victor had hit her and she needed Danny to come get her belongings. It was obviously a trap. Victor wanted Danny alone so Shane could finish what they'd started. But traps only worked when the prey didn't know they were walking into one. Danny arrived at his house at precisely 3 p.m. as Sandy had requested. Victor was waiting on the front porch, Shane beside him. Both men were clearly expecting this to go only one way. "Well, look who's back," Victor said, standing up from Danny's own porch chair. "Sandy's inside packing. You can wait out here." "Actually," Danny said, his voice conversational, "I think we need to talk first." Shane stepped forward, cracking his knuckles in what Danny supposed was meant to be intimidating. Shane Moore was bigger than his brother, 6'4", maybe 240, with the kind of muscle that came from manual labor rather than gyms. His arms were covered in tattoos that told the story of a man who'd spent significant time in the prison system. "Nothing to talk about, soldier boy," Shane said. "You lost your family. Time to move on." Danny smiled, and both brothers took an unconscious step back. It wasn't a nice smile. "You know what I learned in Afghanistan?" Danny asked, still smiling. "The difference between courage and stupidity is usually about 30 seconds and better intelligence." Victor looked confused, but Shane was smarter. His hand moved towards something in his jacket. "I also learned," Danny continued, "that the most dangerous enemies are the ones who have nothing left to lose." That's when the cameras Jim Peterson had installed caught Shane drawing a knife, giving Danny all the legal justification he needed for what happened next. The fight lasted exactly 43 seconds. When it was over, Shane was unconscious with a dislocated shoulder and a broken jaw, and Victor was on his knees, begging Danny not to kill him. "Please," Victor sobbed, blood streaming from his nose. "We can work this out." "We can. You're right," Danny said, hauling Victor to his feet. "We can work this out. In fact, I'm going to give you exactly what you deserve." Danny looked directly into the camera Jim was monitoring from next door, then spoke clearly. "Victor Moore, you're under citizen's arrest for child abuse, assault, and threatening a federal officer." Then he grabbed Victor by the throat and said quietly, "But first, you're going to show me what you've been hiding in my garage." What Danny found in his garage would have made a DEA agent weep with joy. The Moore brothers weren't just small-time predators. They were running a distribution hub for fentanyl trafficking, using Danny's military credentials and spotless record as cover for an operation that supplied drugs to 3 surrounding counties. But more than that, Danny found evidence of their other activities. Photos of victims, including children. Documentation of sales that weren't just drugs. And most damning of all, Victor's journal, which detailed his hunting methods and included plans for what he called the final lesson for Austin. Danny had found enough evidence to put both brothers away for life. But more importantly, he'd found something else. The hammer Victor had used to crush Austin's hands, carefully wrapped and hidden like a trophy. As sirens approached, Jim had called 911 the moment the fight started. Danny hefted the hammer and looked at Victor, who was still conscious despite his injuries. "You said these hands would never hold a gun like a coward's," Danny said softly. "You were right about one thing. My son will never be a coward." Then Danny raised the hammer, and Victor's screams echoed through the neighborhood as he learned exactly what it felt like to have his hands systematically destroyed by someone who knew precisely what he was doing. By the time the police arrived, they found a federal crime scene, 2 suspects in need of medical attention, and a decorated Army captain who had single-handedly uncovered a trafficking operation that the DEA had been hunting for 2 years. But the story was just getting started. Chapter 4. The Reckoning begins. The next 72 hours were a whirlwind of federal agents, media attention, and legal proceedings that would have overwhelmed a lesser man. But Danny Dale had spent his military career dealing with complex, high-stakes situations, and he approached this crisis with the same methodical precision that had made him an effective intelligence officer. The DEA was ecstatic. Special Agent Nicholas Hardy, A 20-year veteran who'd been tracking the Moore brothers network for months, treated Danny like a conquering hero. The evidence found in Danny's garage linked Victor and Shane to distribution networks across 3 states, involving millions of dollars in fentanyl sales and dozens of victims. Captain Dale, Agent Hardy said during one of many debriefings, "You've handed us the biggest break in this case we've had in 2 years. This network has been responsible for over 40 overdose deaths that we can prove, probably twice that many we can't." But Danny wasn't interested in accolades. He wanted to ensure that every single person connected to the Moore brothers paid for their crimes. More importantly, he wanted to make sure that what had happened to Austin never happened to another child. The media attention was both blessing and curse. On one hand, it ensured that the Moore brothers' crimes received maximum exposure. Austin's story became a rallying cry for victims' rights groups and military families. On the other hand, it put a spotlight on Danny's own actions during the confrontation. The local district attorney, an ambitious politician named Lawrence McKenna, was less enthusiastic about Danny's vigilante justice. While he couldn't deny that Danny had uncovered a major criminal operation, he was uncomfortable with the methods used. "Captain Dale," DA McKenna said during a tense meeting, "I understand your motivation, but we can't have citizens taking the law into their own hands. The injuries you inflicted on Victor Moore were extensive." Danny looked McKenna straight in the eye. "Victor Moore systematically crushed my 8-year-old son's hands with a hammer and kept it as a trophy. I gave him exactly what he gave Austin. No more, no less. That's not how the law works. The law failed my son. I didn't." In the end, politics won out over principles. The federal case against the Moore brothers was too important to risk with a messy prosecution of the man who'd made it possible. Danny was charged with simple assault, a misdemeanor that would likely result in probation and community service. The Moore brothers, meanwhile, faced federal trafficking charges, state charges for child abuse, and a growing list of charges from other jurisdictions as more victims came forward. But Danny's real victory was just beginning. Austin's story had struck a nerve with the public. Donations poured in for his medical expenses and rehabilitation. More importantly, other victims of the Moore brothers began to come forward, armed with the courage that comes from knowing they're not alone. One of those victims was Elisa Barnes, a woman from Oklahoma whose daughter had been one of Victor's earlier targets. Elisa had been trying to get authorities to listen to her for 3 years. Now, with the Moore brothers in custody and facing serious charges, she finally had her chance. "They said my daughter fell downstairs," Elisa told Danny during a phone call that reduced both of them to tears. "But I knew. I always knew. She was only 6 years old, and Victor broke her arm in 3 places because she wouldn't stop crying for her daddy." Similar stories emerged from Texas, Arkansas, and Missouri. A pattern of abuse spanning nearly a decade, targeting military families specifically because the fathers were deployed and couldn't protect their children. The Moore brothers hadn't just been predators. They'd been domestic terrorists, using the very service of America's military families against them. Danny organized a network of these families, creating a support group that would ensure none of them faced their trauma alone. But more than that, he began planning something that would ensure the Moore brothers' punishment extended far beyond whatever the courts might impose. The plan was audacious, even by Danny's standards, but it was also necessary. Victor and Shane Moore had spent years hunting military families. Now Danny was going to give them a taste of what it felt like to be hunted. Chapter 5. Inside Information. Danny's first break came from an unexpected source, Sandy herself. His wife had been devastated by the revelations about Victor's true nature, but more than that, she was terrified. Victor had made it clear that she was just another victim in his collection, and that her usefulness would end the moment he tired of her. He kept journals, Sandy told Danny during a tear-filled conversation at the motel. Not just about the trafficking, about all of us, all his victims. He has plans, Danny, detailed plans for what he calls retirement scenarios. The journals Victor kept were more than just documentation. They were instruction manuals for targeting and controlling victims. Danny learned that Victor had been watching military families for months before making contact, learning their routines, their vulnerabilities, their fears. He'd identified Sandy as a target long before he'd ever met her. But the journals also revealed something else. Victor's network was larger than anyone had suspected. The Moore brothers weren't independent operators. They were part of a larger organization that specialized in exploiting military families across the entire southeastern United States. Agent Hardy was skeptical at first. "Captain Dale, we've been tracking organized crime for decades. This kind of systematic targeting, it would require resources, coordination. It would require someone with access to military databases," Danny finished. "Someone who could identify deployed soldiers, their families, their locations." The implications were staggering. If Danny was right, the Moore brothers' operation was being fed information by someone inside the military or Department of Defense. Someone with clearance and access who was selling out the families of deployed soldiers for profit. Danny's investigation took on new urgency. Using his own military contacts and clearance, he began tracing the information flows that had led Victor to his family. What he found was a corruption scandal that reached much higher than two predatory brothers from Arkansas. Staff Sergeant Charles Post, an administrator at Fort Carson, had been selling deployment schedules and family information to criminal organizations for 3 years. Post's gambling debts had made him vulnerable to recruitment, and his access to personnel files had made him valuable to predators like the Moore brothers. But Post was small fish. The real prize was his handler, Colonel Edgar Collins, a 30-year veteran who'd been using his position to coordinate what amounted to a military family harvesting operation. Collins had identified families that would be vulnerable during deployment, then connected them with predators who would exploit that vulnerability for profit. Danny felt sick as the scope of the betrayal became clear. Men and women who'd sworn to protect American families had instead been selling them to the highest bidder. Austin wasn't just the victim of two sadistic brothers. He was the victim of a systemic corruption that had turned America's military against its own families. The evidence was overwhelming, but Danny knew that military justice moved slowly. Collins had connections, lawyers, influence. He would fight any charges and probably emerge with nothing more than early retirement and a reduced pension. That wasn't good enough. Not for Austin. Not for the dozens of other children who'd been hurt. Not for the families who'd been betrayed by the very institution that was supposed to protect them. Danny made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He was going to destroy Edgar Collins and everyone connected to this operation, using methods that the military justice system could never employ. But first, he needed to get close to Collins. And for that, he needed the help of someone Collins would never suspect. Another victim of the Moore brothers' network. Chapter 6. Allies and Enemies. Danny's recruitment of Carmen Carroll was perhaps the most morally complex decision of his entire campaign. Carmen was a former Navy wife whose husband had been killed in Iraq 5 years earlier. She'd become one of Victor's victims when her grief made her vulnerable to his particular brand of predatory charm. Her 7-year-old son, Matt, had suffered injuries similar to Austin's, though Carmen had been too terrified to seek help at the time. What made Carmen valuable to Danny's plan was her connection to Colonel Collins. Her late husband had served under Collins' command, and Collins had personally delivered the death notification. In the years since, Collins had maintained contact with Carmen, ostensibly as part of his duties to Gold Star families. In reality, Collins had been monitoring her for the same network that had eventually sent Victor to exploit her grief. "He comes to the house every few months," Carmen told Danny during their first meeting. "Always asking about Matt, about how we're doing financially. I thought he was being kind, but now you understand he was evaluating you for targeting," Danny finished. "Carmen, I know what I'm asking is dangerous, but Collins is the key to this entire operation. Without him feeding information to predators like Victor, none of this would have been possible." Carmen looked at her son, who was playing quietly in the corner. Matt's hands bore scars similar to Austin's, permanent reminders of Victor's lessons about respect and obedience. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Carmen would approach Collins with a fabricated financial crisis, making herself appear vulnerable to whatever predator Collins might connect her with. Danny would use his own military intelligence training to monitor the communication and identify everyone in Colin's network. But Danny had a secondary objective that Carmen didn't know about. He was going to use the operation to identify every family that had been targeted, then ensure that each predator in the network faced personal justice that the courts could never provide. Working with Agent Hardy, Danny established a monitoring operation that would have impressed his former intelligence colleagues. Carmen's house was equipped with surveillance equipment. Her communications were monitored, and every person who contacted her was identified and investigated. The results exceeded Danny's expectations. Within 2 weeks, Collins had connected Carmen with 3 different predators, each specializing in different types of exploitation. Jeremy Dillon focused on financial fraud, draining bank accounts, and stealing benefits. Vince Hinton specialized in psychological manipulation, breaking down victims' self-esteem until they became completely dependent. And Adam Leonard was a trafficker who moved victims across state lines for purposes that made Danny's blood run cold. But it was the 4th contact that changed everything. Dr. Kenneth Weber, a military psychiatrist who'd been treating PTSD in military families, had been using his position to identify the most vulnerable victims and funnel them into the network. Weber had personally treated dozens of military spouses and children, gaining their trust before facilitating their exploitation. Danny realized they weren't just dealing with a criminal network. They were dealing with a systematic betrayal of trust that had infected the very institutions meant to protect military families. The corruption ran so deep that Danny began to question whether the official justice system could be trusted to handle it at all. That doubt became certainty when Danny learned that DA Lawrence McKenna had been receiving donations from shell companies connected to Colin's network. The man responsible for prosecuting the Moore brothers had been financially connected to their operation from the beginning. Danny's faith in the system died completely that night. He sat in his motel room, looking at Austin sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks, and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. The system couldn't be trusted to deliver justice, which meant Danny would have to deliver it himself. He spent the rest of the night planning what would become known as the Night of Reckoning, a coordinated strike against every member of the network that would eliminate them as threats while ensuring that their victims finally received the justice they deserved. Danny Dale had been a soldier, a father, and a man who believed in institutions. Now he was becoming something else entirely, the instrument of justice for victims who had no other hope. Chapter 7. The Night of Reckoning. October 31st was chosen for practical as well as symbolic reasons. Halloween night provided cover for unusual activities, and the date gave Danny exactly 36 hours to coordinate the most complex civilian operation of his career. By dawn on November 1st, every member of Colin's network would face consequences that the legal system could never impose. Danny's recruitment efforts had expanded beyond Carmen. Through the victim support network he'd established, he'd identified 12 families that had been systematically targeted and exploited. But more than that, he discovered something remarkable. Several of the targeted military spouses had backgrounds that made them uniquely qualified for what Danny was planning. Stephanie Donnelly's husband had been special forces before his death in Afghanistan. She'd learned surveillance and evasion techniques through pillow talk and practice. Cindy Salazar had been a military police officer before her marriage, with training in detention and interrogation. Isabel Plummer's father had been a demolitions expert who'd taught his daughter more than the Army ever intended a civilian to know. These women had lost everything to Colin's network. Their husbands, their security, their children's innocence, all sacrificed to feed predators who hid behind military credentials and institutional authority. But they also had skills, motivation, and most importantly, nothing left to lose. Danny's plan was ambitious. 7 simultaneous operations targeting every key member of the network. The operations would be coordinated to prevent any target from warning the others, and each would be tailored to deliver justice appropriate to the target's specific crimes. Operation 1 targeted Staff Sergeant Charles Post at his off-base apartment. Post's gambling debts had made him vulnerable to recruitment, but they'd also given him delusions of importance. Stephanie Donnelly's approach was simple. She appeared at his door, claiming to be sent by his bookmaker with an offer to settle his debts. Post's greed overcame his caution, and he found himself zip-tied to a chair while Stephanie methodically destroyed every finger that had typed orders betraying military families. Operation 2 focused on Jeremy Dillon at his financial consulting office. Dillon had specialized in draining the bank accounts of military widows, using forged documents and identity theft to steal hundreds of thousands in benefits and insurance payments. Cindy Salazar's military police training proved invaluable as she conducted a compliance inspection that left Dillon hanging from his office ceiling by his ankles, every stolen dollar in cash taped to his body as evidence of his crimes. Operations 3 through 6 targeted the various predators Collins had connected to vulnerable families. Each operation was precisely calibrated. Psychological manipulators found themselves subjected to enhanced interrogation techniques that broke their minds as thoroughly as they'd broken their victims. Traffickers discovered what it felt like to be restrained and helpless, facing the same terror they'd inflicted on children. But Operation 7 was personal. Danny handled Colonel Edgar Collins himself. Collins lived in a sprawling house in Colorado Springs, the kind of residence that a 30-year military career and careful investments could provide. Or, as Danny had discovered, the kind that selling military families to predators could purchase. Danny waited until 11 p.m., when Collins' wife was at her weekly bridge game and the house was empty except for the man who'd made Austin's suffering possible. The alarm system was military-grade, but Danny had helped design the protocols it was based on. The locks were impressive, but not to someone with Danny's training. Collins was in his study, reviewing files that Danny recognized as profiles of potential victims, military families marked for exploitation. The colonel looked up when Danny entered, his face cycling through surprise, recognition, and finally, understanding. "Captain Dale," Collins said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I've been expecting you." "Have you?" Danny closed the door behind him, noting the exits, weapons, and potential complications. "Then you know why I'm here. I know what you think you know, but you're missing the bigger picture." Collins gestured to the files on his desk. "This operation has prevented more suffering than it's caused. We identify families that are already vulnerable and connect them with people who can provide services. It's harm reduction." Danny's laugh was cold enough to frost windows. "Harm reduction? You sold my son to a predator who destroyed his hands with a hammer. Your son was going to be victimized anyway. Military families always are, by con artists, by predators, by people who see vulnerability and exploit it. At least our way, there's some oversight, some control." Danny stepped closer, and Collins' composure finally cracked. "You destroyed families for profit and convinced yourself it was mercy. That makes you worse than Victor Moore." At least he was honest about what he was. What happened next was neither quick nor painless. Collins had betrayed every principle he'd sworn to uphold, had sold the children of deployed soldiers to monsters for money. Danny made sure he understood the consequences of those choices in the most direct way possible. By dawn, Collins would be found in his study, alive, but permanently reminded of his crimes in ways that would prevent him from ever harming another military family. But the night of reckoning wasn't complete. There was still one more target to address. The man who'd enabled the entire network by ensuring legal consequences never materialized. Chapter 8, Justice Served. District Attorney Lawrence McKenna's corruption had been more subtle than the others, but in many ways more damaging. McKenna had ensured that investigations into military family exploitation were delayed, evidence was lost, and charges were reduced or dismissed entirely. His office had become a protective shield for predators, bought and paid for with money stolen from the families those predators victimized. Danny's approach to McKenna required a different strategy. Unlike the others, McKenna was a public figure with security, staff, and visibility that made direct action risky. But McKenna also had something the others lacked: political ambitions that made him vulnerable to public exposure. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Danny had documented everything: Collins' files, the network's communication records, financial transactions that traced money from victim accounts to McKenna's campaign funds. But rather than simply releasing the information, Danny orchestrated its revelation in a way that would destroy McKenna's career while ensuring the evidence couldn't be suppressed. The setup began 3 days after the night of reckoning. McKenna was scheduled to speak at a Veterans Day ceremony, an event that would be covered by every major media outlet in Colorado. The irony of a corrupt prosecutor speaking about honoring military families wasn't lost on Danny. What McKenna didn't know was that several of the military spouses in the audience weren't there to honor his speech. Carmen Carroll, Stephanie Donnelly, Cindy Salazar, and Isabel Plummer had coordinated with local media to ensure that McKenna's crimes would be exposed in the most public way possible. The revelation began during McKenna's speech about supporting our military families. As he spoke about the sacrifices made by deployed soldiers, Carmen stood up in the audience. "Mr. McKenna," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the ceremony. "How can you talk about supporting military families when you've been taking money from the people who prey on them?" McKenna tried to maintain his composure, but the damage was already done. The television cameras were rolling, and Stephanie Donnelly was already standing with a folder full of evidence. "You took campaign contributions from shell companies run by Edgar Collins," Stephanie announced. The same Edgar Collins who sold military family information to predators like Victor Moore. The same Victor Moore who crushed an 8-year-old boy's hands with a hammer. The media erupted. McKenna tried to leave the podium, but Isabel Plummer blocked his path with a banner that displayed bank records showing the money trail from victim accounts to McKenna's campaigns. Cindy Salazar was distributing copies of the evidence to reporters, ensuring that every detail of the corruption would be public knowledge within hours. McKenna's political career died that day, buried under evidence of corruption that even his political allies couldn't ignore. But more importantly, the exposure of his role in the network triggered federal investigations that reached far beyond Colorado. McKenna's files contained information about similar operations in other states, other corrupt officials, other networks of predators that had been feeding on military families for years. The ripple effects were exactly what Danny had hoped for. Within weeks, federal investigations had identified and dismantled similar networks in 7 states. Dozens of predators were arrested, hundreds of victims came forward, and the systematic exploitation of military families finally received the attention it deserved. But for Danny, the victory was personal rather than political. Austin's hands would never fully heal, but the men who'd hurt him would never hurt another child. The system that had failed to protect military families was being reformed, and the predators who'd exploited that system's failures were facing consequences that would prevent them from ever operating again. More importantly, Austin was healing in ways that went beyond the physical. The knowledge that his father had fought for him, that justice had been served, that the monsters who'd hurt him were gone forever. All of that gave the boy a foundation for recovery that no amount of physical therapy could provide. "Daddy," Austin said one evening as they sat together in their new apartment, "are the bad men ever coming back?" "No, buddy," Danny replied, holding his son carefully. "They're never coming back. And if anyone ever tries to hurt you again, they'll have to go through me first." Austin smiled, the first real smile Danny had seen since coming home. "I'm not scared anymore." Neither was Danny. The man who'd returned from Afghanistan had been a soldier following orders, working within a system he trusted. The man he'd become was something else entirely, a father who'd learned that sometimes justice required going beyond the system to ensure the innocent were protected. The war was over. His family was safe, and the predators who'd threatened them would never threaten anyone again. Chapter 9, New Beginnings. 6 months after the night of reckoning, Danny Dale stood in the playground behind Austin's new school, watching his son attempt to throw a baseball with hands that would never work properly again. The boy's determination was inspiring. Each throw was awkward, painful, but delivered with the stubborn persistence that Danny recognized as a Dale family trait. Austin's physical therapy had progressed better than anyone had dared hope. While he would never regain full function in his hands, he developed adaptations that allowed him to write, draw, and even play modified versions of most games. More importantly, the psychological healing had been profound. Knowing that his father had fought for him, that justice had been served, had given Austin a confidence that no physical limitation could diminish. "Looking good, Austin," called Jim Peterson from the sideline. Jim had become more than a neighbor. He'd become the grandfather figure Austin had never had, and his workshop had become Austin's second home. Jim was teaching the boy woodworking, adapting tools and techniques to work with Austin's limited grip strength. Danny's phone buzzed with a text from Agent Hardy. "Collins sentenced today, 25 to life. Last of the network finally behind bars." The legal proceedings had taken months, but every member of Collins' network had been convicted. The evidence Danny and his team had gathered, combined with federal investigations, had built cases that even the best defense attorneys couldn't challenge. Victor and Shane Moore were serving life sentences in federal prison. Collins would die behind bars. McKenna had been disbarred and sentenced to 15 years for corruption. But the real victory was broader than individual convictions. The exposure of the network had triggered reforms throughout the military justice system. New protocols protected the personal information of deployed soldiers' families. Victim support networks received federal funding. And most importantly, the systematic targeting of military families was now recognized as a form of domestic terrorism, with penalties to match. "Daddy," Austin called from the field. "Did you see that throw? I think I'm getting better." Danny walked over to his son, marveling at the boy's resilience. Austin's hands would always bear scars, but his spirit was stronger than ever. The trauma had been transformed into determination, the victimization into a drive to help others who faced similar challenges. "I saw it, buddy. You're definitely getting better. Mr. Peterson says I might be able to play Little League next year if I keep practicing. Would you help me train?" "Every day if you want," Danny promised. That evening, Danny attended a meeting of the support group he'd established for military families affected by predatory crimes. The group had grown from 12 families to over 200, with chapters in 15 states. What had started as Danny's quest for personal justice had evolved into a national advocacy organization that was changing how society protected vulnerable military families. Carmen Carroll had become the group's coordinator, using her experience to help other victims navigate the complex process of recovery and justice. Stephanie Donnelly ran a training program that taught military spouses self-defense and situational awareness. Cindy Salazar had started a scholarship fund for children who'd been victimized, ensuring they had resources for education and therapy. "Danny," Carmen said after the meeting, "I wanted you to know we got another conviction today. That case in Georgia you helped us document. Life sentence." Danny nodded, feeling the satisfaction that came with each successful prosecution. The network they dismantled had been larger than anyone had initially realized, and the evidence they'd gathered continued to produce convictions months later. But more than the legal victories, Danny was proud of what the families had accomplished together. They'd transformed their trauma into a force for positive change, ensuring that what had happened to their children would never happen to others. "Any word on the federal legislation?" Danny asked. "Passed committee yesterday. Should reach the floor next month." Carmen smiled. "The Austin-Dale Protection Act is going to become law." The legislation, named after his son, would create federal oversight of programs serving military families, establish mandatory reporting requirement for suspected abuse, and provide funding for victim services. It was the kind of systemic change that would protect thousands of children, all inspired by one boy's courage in surviving what should have destroyed him. Later that night, as Danny tucked Austin into bed, his son looked up at him with serious brown eyes that reminded Danny so much of his own. "Daddy, do you think the other kids will be okay now? The ones like me? I think they'll be safer," Danny replied honestly. "And I think when bad things happen to them, they'll have people to help them fight back." "Good," Austin said, settling into his pillow. "Nobody should have to be scared like I was." As Danny turned off the light, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. He'd returned from Afghanistan expecting to resume a normal life with his family. Instead, he discovered that the real war had been at home, fought against predators who used the military's own values against its families. The victory had come at a cost. Danny's marriage was over, His military career had ended, and he would carry the weight of what he'd done during the night of reckoning for the rest of his life. But looking at his son's peaceful face, seeing the boy's renewed confidence and joy, Danny knew he'd made the right choices. Victor Moore had said that Austin's hands would never hold a gun like a coward's. He'd been right about one thing. Austin would never be a coward. But Victor had been wrong about everything else. Austin's hands might be scarred, but they were healing. And more importantly, they were free to build a future that no predator could take away. Danny Dale had gone to war to protect freedom. He'd come home to discover that the greatest threat to that freedom was hiding among the very people he'd sworn to protect. But in the end, he'd done what soldiers do. He'd identified the enemy, engaged with overwhelming force, and achieved total victory. The war was over. His son was safe. And somewhere in federal prison, Victor Moore was learning what it felt like to have his own hands broken by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Justice, Danny had learned, wasn't always pretty, but sometimes it was the only thing that could heal wounds that law books and court proceedings could never touch. Austin was going to be okay. They all were. And that was worth everything Danny had sacrificed to make it happen.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.